Blue, 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 blue. Almost always the first thing someone mentions when seeing my uniform. So, why so blue? Well, in this film I will talk about the origins of Great War French light blue, and why the French uniform of the Great War just so happened to be blue. Disclaimer: the goal here is not to talk about things that have already been said. The goal here is to reveal new info. I don't like stepping over other people's work when discussing history, so I will try to talk about things that really have not been discussed in any notable capacity on film, as the story of Horizon Blue has already been talked about multiple times before. It is very easy to fall into the deep lore of Horizon Blue, so I will attempt to provide only a summary on the uniform color itself. So please note that more specific information will be omitted when discussing uniform modernization in the French Army, such as uniform cut and gear details. Also note that I'm going to start this tale around the 1910s. This may disappoint some, as this means I'm not going to talk about earlier experimental uniforms like the Boer uniform of 1903, the beige blue uniform of 1906, and other various webbing tests like the Aubrey pack of 1907. I'm doing this because the story of Horizon Blue does not necessarily need to include these other trial uniforms, as how the events unfolded to create Horizon Blue really only began by the 1910s. And this film is already going to be quite long, so with that said, let's get into the prelude. At the beginning of the Great War, there existed something called Red Pants politics. This was the nickname given to a section of the French political sphere who refused to entertain the idea of a new modernized uniform for the French military. By the late 1900s, early 1910s, it was already known that the current uniform of the French army was not adequate for the modern battlefield, this uniform being the blued steel gray greatcoat and madder red trousers. The days of black powder were over. Commanders no longer had to directly survey the battle and command troops fighting within a smoky landscape. In that case, a soldier with a striking uniform was able to stand out from the enemy, and it actually aided in troop direction and reduced friendly fire incidents. Smokeless powder, created in France for use in the Lebel rifle in 1884, had removed the need for identifiable uniforms within an obscure battlefield, and thus more muted uniform colors became an option to wear. Studies were conducted in 1892, which determined that it was more difficult to shoot at a gray-blue target than at a red and blue one, showing the legitimacy of a muted color uniform. Later on, the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, and Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, would demonstrate to European commanders that concealment of the individual soldier had become a real tactical strategy. By this point, many countries had already chosen to outfit their troops in an early form of camouflage, using muted colors of browns, greens, and grays. However, France, despite being the creators of smokeless powder, refused to update their military uniform. The blued steel gray greatcoat and madder red trousers had become a symbol of national pride. This uniform had formed deep roots in French military culture. The French believed they had the most powerful army in Europe. Their spirit of the offensive strategy of fighting helped create the cultural myth that the French would roll right over their opponents. The fighting spirit of the French soldier, as they believed, would be the deciding factor in combat, and that spirit was directly tied to the colors of the French uniform, which many believed gave the soldier the necessary morale and violent spirit needed to close in with the enemy. So by 1914, the blued steel gray and red uniform was nearing a century old. To understand why, we will have to get into some backstory. King Charles X, in 1829, had ordered the use of the color red for military uniforms, in order to revive the French practice of dyer's madder. The dye was obtained from the roots of Rubia tinctorum that, when mixed with certain chemicals, resulted in a rich red color. So by kingly command, this method of dyeing was used on the new red trousers of the French army. But from 1860 onwards, overexploited land would permanently damage the culture of garrets, and less natural red dye could be used. In the late 19th century, the natural dye had to compete with the production of a synthetic red dye called alizarin, created by the German company BASF. Natural dye simply could not compete with synthetics, and this would lead to the end of the French manufacturing of garrets. The synthetic alizarin could be produced for a fraction of the cost of the natural product, and the market for madder collapsed virtually overnight. Yes, in an insane turn of events, German synthetic red dye had to be sourced for French uniforms. One can start seeing the reason why the red pants were so politicized. The French military, after suffering a defeat in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, had to source German material for their uniform. Despite this, the red pants persisted into the 20th century, as the French public still believed that the red pants defined the French soldier. If anything, the French defeat only increased nationalism and support of a distinctively French uniform that must be worn when revenge is taken against Germany. French dyers also lobbied hard in the defense of red trousers, as it was in their best interest to do so. They wanted to continue to produce their natural dyes to compete with the synthetics. Talks were beginning to form on the issue of the red pants, specifically on uniform color modernization and a potential uniform upgrade to replace the blue steel gray and madder red colors of the current uniform. They would all be pushed back with the same arguments. One was the idea of the spirit of the Corps. Many officers did not want their long-standing traditional uniforms changed by the stroke of a pen. Fair enough. Additionally, they believed muted colors would lower morale of the troops and went against current Parisian taste and characteristics of the French soldier, to be seen as a coward in the eyes of the enemy. As, at the time, many did believe that muted uniform colors showed cowardice and the need to hide from enemy fire. Another argument was that the absence of any distinctive colors would cause friendly fire incidents on the battlefield. Many talked of potentially misidentifying French soldiers as Germans. This was a failure to acknowledge the benefit of camouflage at all, especially at the border with Germany. This argument does have merit though, as friendly fire was considered a large issue at the time of black powder, which once again is why armies chose to wear bright and distinctive uniforms. The public, however, was really not aware of the changing battlefield and use of smokeless powder making bright uniforms obsolete. Remember that war was still heavily romanticized before the Great War, and the people had no frame of reference for the actual reality of modern combat. At this point, their opinions were based on tailored stories of glorious battle and famous artwork depicting individual heroes wearing striking uniforms. The old lie that it was honorable to die for one's nation was still a widely held belief, and the French believed their uniform proved that their soldiers stood unafraid at an honorable demise. Nothing depicted the actual brutality and suffering of combat, so the people had only recruitment propaganda to form an opinion on. And of course, the army believed that what was necessary for recruitment was a traditional, distinctive, and undoubtedly French uniform that inspired people to sign up. With all this said, some people against a uniform upgrade did acknowledge that the uniform could be easily spotted in a battlefield environment. However, their solutions revolved around camouflaging the accessories and dulling the blue and red to be less visible. They also believed that flashy portions of the uniform, like the greatcoat buttons and belt buckle, could simply be masked when on campaign. So, red pants politics did not stop all modernizations of French kit, and in the early 1900s there were several efforts to redesign the French uniform. A commission was formed, tasked with designing a new French uniform, headed by General Detaille. This upgrade included new headgear, a new tunic cut, new leather equipment, camouflage rank and unit tabs, and the introduction of puttees, wool leg wraps, to replace the black leather gaiters, and breeches to replace the trousers. New webbing was created that provided better load bearing than the Haversack Model 1893, and new leather gear and tin work was to accompany it. By 1911, a full uniform upgrade was created, named after the Reseda plant due to the use of the plant to dye the uniform to a gray-green color. This outfit was extensively tested in major maneuvers the same year, and showed great promise for uniform modernization advocates. However, the general French populace hated the new color. Many believed that it was too close to the German uniform and appearance, and not in conformity with French spirit, as by this point, the Germans had replaced their old flashy uniform with a modern cut in field gray. Many in France held on to the idea of defeating Germany with the same uniforms used in the Franco-Prussian War, and thus refused any changes to the current uniform. But what really got the French populace united against the gray-green uniform was the magazine L'Illustration, which heavily criticized Reseda. A journalist writes that in Paris there appears to be some soldiers equipped with a new ugly outfit, with long pants that have nothing to do with military tradition, a new helmet that crushes the head of the soldier, and most importantly, that the uniform consists of a sad color that looks like goose poop. Yeah. In fact, experimental outfits were the subject of such strong criticism that any potential uniform upgrade had to be absolutely perfect for opinions to be swayed, and this search of perfection would only stall any attempts to change the uniform. Even those in favor of modernization could not fully accept the Reseda uniform, as such a large-scale upgrade required money to be dumped into the military, something that many on the left side of the political spectrum did not agree with. The military leadership in France generally leaned towards the right, and thus military spending had to be checked as to not give political adversaries too much monetary power, so such a radical upgrade was not possible in the eyes of many. This division in thought meant that the pro-red trouser section of the debate simply had a stronger base and could sway the debate in their favor. What kept the Reseda uniform in the spotlight was that the Minister of War, Maurice Berthaud, supported the new uniform, and with his strong support, the uniform was set to become the new uniform of the infantry despite public backlash. However, Berthaud was accidentally killed on May 21st, 1911, at the start of the 1911 Paris to Madrid air race, when a monoplane made a forced landing and crashed into a group of people, including Maurice Berthaud. The Reseda uniform lost its biggest supporter, and the trials would end in September 1911, remaining inconclusive. Berthaud would be replaced by Adolphe Messimy as Minister of War, and he was persuaded by the opponents of Reseda Green to continue with testing. Once again, the opponents of any new uniform were in search of perfection and believed that Reseda needed further testing, stalling a new uniform once more. To appeal to the red pants crowd, Messimy would create a new commission with Edouard Detaille, notable academic painter and military artist, and Georgia Scott, war correspondent and artist for L'Illustration magazine. Both were on the conservative side of the red pants discussion and had a large following, and this pretty much solidified the red pants in any potential uniform created by this commission in the foreseeable future. This commission also believed that only the infantry needed any modifications to the existing uniform. However, the modifications proposed to the infantry uniform were only minor alterations and really not serious modernizations to the kit. They proposed that the black leather gaiters be replaced by blued steel gray puttees to further mask the red trousers. In regards to the red kepi, a blued steel gray covering will be worn when on campaign. The idea here was to use existing blued steel gray greatcoat wool scraps for the material needed for this change, thus eliminating any disruption of uniform supply. In regards to the Reseda uniform, the commission still had to review it and send it on its way. They stated that the color of this uniform would decrease morale in the army, as soldiers desire to distinguish themselves through their uniform. Yes, really. However, there was growing support for the Reseda uniform by this point, so the committee folded on the issue and only altered the Reseda uniform slightly. And I know this next part sounds like something out of a historical drama, but the change they made to the Reseda uniform that they can all agree on was none other than the red pants. Yes, if the Reseda uniform was to be adopted by the army, it would feature a new cut of red breeches. Meanwhile, the committee was still tasked with designing a new uniform, and Edouard Detaille would propose a new full dress and field dress for the infantry. Like the Reseda uniform, breeches replaced the old trousers because breeches were cut by the knee to allow the use of puttees. The uniforms Detaille created are actually quite good looking, to be honest, which is expected coming from such a talented artist. His ideas can be considered a complete uniform redesign, everything from headgear to boots, and I really think he poured his heart and soul into his last great piece of artwork. One can say this uniform in terms of fitment has adapted to the modern battlefield, while also keeping the traditional colors of the army, once again keeping the blue and of course red colors of the current uniform. The combat uniform specifically hid the shiny buttons of the greatcoat and also masked the large shiny buckle of the belt model 1845. By this point, Alexandre Mirand had replaced Adolphe Messimy as Minister of War, and thus he was tasked with testing these final two uniforms, the second model Reseda uniform and the Detaille uniform. Both patterns were presented to the public during Bastille Day, July 14, 1912, during the military parade review. Once again, the public and political opinion was in deadlock over the red pants. Around October 1912, Adolphe Messimy, still involved with uniform modernization, would visit the Balkan front and saw the advantages of a dual-colored uniform in combat by the Bulgarians. He returned to France even more determined to camouflage the French soldier. At a parliamentary hearing, Messimy would advocate for the first model of Reseda and would once again be met with great protest. Messimy would point out that from what he saw on the modern battlefield, French fighting spirit and military function are no longer synonymous, but his opponents remained stubborn. This is where Eugene Etienne, a former war minister, spoke these iconic words that finally killed any serious attempts to modernize the French uniform. Etienne would say, quote, "Eliminate the red trousers? Never. The red trousers are France," end quote. In his memoirs, a disheartened Adolphe Messimy would write about how Reseda was tactically sound and that the test results were conclusive. This was the color of the modern soldier. However, Reseda did not account for the newspapers and the commissions of the French Chamber, who continued to oppose any adoption of a modern uniform in favor of keeping the red trousers. Messimy would write that the blind and imbecile attachment to the most visible of all colors was to have cruel consequences, and sadly he would be proven right in 1914. After this meeting, and with the second model Reseda and Detaille uniforms not satisfying any side of the aisle, Messimy and the uniform commissions would once again search for another experimental uniform, one that featured the patriotic French colors in a more neutral shade. And as a side note, Edouard Detaille would pass away on December 23, 1912, aged 64, leaving his uniform designs as the culmination of his experiences as a military artist, and a showcase to his skill as a painter. It's a bit of a shame that he went to the great beyond without seeing the finale of Red Pants politics. The year is 1913, a new year, but once again, the French army is stuck with an old uniform. By this point, the writing was on the wall, and France stood in Western Europe as the only country that still uses a black powder era uniform. The General Dubai Commission, having gone back to the drawing boards, claimed that they finally found the solution that everyone on both sides of the debate can agree with. The color they designed was called tricolor cloth. As the name suggests, the material, wool, was composed of the colors of the French flag, specifically 60% blue, 30% red, and 10% white threads. Tricolor cloth, according to Professor Charles Moreau, leading the Commission for Chemical Studies and Experiments of the Ministry of War, produced an impression of ill-defined blue or gray to the eye. Work on this uniform was slow, as its design had to please all corners of the Red Pants debate, having to symbolize the French fighting tradition, blend in with the European landscape, and also be cheap to produce. The High Council of War voted to officially adopt the tricolor cloth on May 26, 1914, but there was still no actual prototype tricolor uniform produced. This was because the only place the red dye was produced was, of course, in Germany. Yeah, the alizarin used up to this point for the red pants, as stated previously, was still only made in Germany. The Red Pants debate focused on this aspect now, as of course tensions between France and Germany by early 1914 were at the tipping point of war. Under no circumstances did the army want to rely on German dye in their new uniforms. Despite this, the tricolor uniform was approved for trials in the army. The hope here was that French manufacturers would begin to produce synthetic red dyes in France once research and testing on the matter, no pun intended, were successful. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, and the July crisis afterward meant that, while a new uniform was now urgently needed, the debate was once again at a standstill because Germany held the red dye for the tricolor uniform. Adolphe Messimy, on July 10th, once again acting as Minister of War, would pass a law for the, quote, substitution of current sheets with a neutral colored sheet, end quote. This new sheet, of course, is tricolor cloth. Requirements posted a week later, July 18, 1914, outlined that all wool uniforms and wool gear were to be replaced with the new tricolor cloth. Adolphe Messimy would officially accept the tricolor uniform on July 27, 1914. However, Germany would actually end the uniform debate on France's behalf, and would declare war on France on August 3, 1914, sealing the fate of the tricolor uniform and the red dye. So after over a decade of experimental uniform projects and the rejection of these projects in search for perfection, France had finally managed to choose a modern uniform reform featuring a less noticeable color. However, the war against Germany had begun, and the soldiers will march to war with the uniforms of 1870. On August 8, 1914, Logistics Chief Detaille, Director of Logistics of the Ministry of War, would renounce the adoption of tricolor cloth upon the advice of Mr. Maurice Allon, production manager of the Balzan Company and cloth manufacturer at the Châtellerault cloth factory. As the tricolor uniform had already been accepted for production, the idea arose that the new uniform would begin production with the red thread simply omitted in the wool blend. Mr. Allon, however, would disagree with this notion. He believed that two factors prevented the adoption of tricolor: the lack of alizarin dye and the difficulty of putting tricolor into production by all French cloth manufacturers, who would have to refit their lines during wartime, a near impossible task to complete. This is because the tricolor cloth must be dyed with indigo to match the regulation shade. However, the mills have not stocked indigo dye in large enough quantities. In response, the War Ministry on August 14th demanded by telephone for the Balzan Company to provide samples of new cloths in different tones of blue between the regulation shades blue steeled gray and sky blue. That same day, Maurice Allon, director of production at the mill, proposed that existing blued steel gray cloth can be incorporated into this new tone instead of indigo. This would allow cloth manufacturers to use existing wool fibers already dyed, and the know-how of the dyers would be maintained when producing the new uniform. On the morning of August 16, 1914, the administrative director of drapery at Châtellerault, Roger de la Selle, would bring samples of this new blue shade to Paris to show the War Ministry. Later, Logistics Chief Detaille submitted the cloth samples to Adolphe Messimy in his office, who personally selected the blue steel gray cloth brightened by light blue fibers and white fibers. Specifically, the shade of cloth that used 15% iron gray blue yarn, 35% white yarn, and 50% light blue cavalry yarn. The following day, on August 17, 1914, this cloth pattern is officially adopted for sets of uniforms for the French Army. In regards to the color change, Professor Charles Moreau would write that, quote, "When the urgency of the situation finally imposed the need for an immediate solution, we found ourselves deprived of alizarin red, which we imported entirely from Germany. It was necessary to give up one of the elements of the tricolor cloth, and they contented themselves with a cloth composed of blue indigo wool and white wool." End quote. The uniform color, originally planned to be a muted blue-gray, would now appear as a light blue. As such, the uniform would be officially named light blue cloth, beginning production in mid-August 1914. The uniform color, originally planned to be a muted blue-gray, would now appear as a light blue. As such, the uniform would be officially named light blue cloth, beginning production in mid-August 1914. Ultimately, the final form of tricolor, or light blue as we know it, is not created from the simple removal of red thread from the regulation tricolor cloth. It was now the mixture of 3 shades of cloth that France already produced for other uniforms, which its clothing mills were already equipped for, and which stock was readily available. Meanwhile, the military was facing war with Germany, and thus looked to adopt any modern uniform. The army took a look at British khaki. However, production of this uniform was reserved for their troops, and the influx of recruits at the outbreak of war meant that no spares could be given to the French. Development of a French khaki began, but the lack of appropriate dyes meant that the shade would appear more yellow than British khaki, giving the unofficial name of mustard cloth. This lack of dyes also meant that large enough quantities to supply the growing army in 1914 was not possible, and thus it was decided that this mustard uniform would be issued to colonial troops beginning at the end of 1914. As for the new light blue uniform itself, it was a modern cut with lessons learned from the previous experimental uniforms. The breeches and puttees remained, however unit identification tabs were still in their bright colors. The shiny buttons were painted over in dark blue, and new leather gear was left in their natural color over the previous black. Anyways, the influx of new recruits meant that immediately there would be a great shortage of this new uniform, and thus the French Ministry of War gave requirements for clothing companies to use existing stocks of blued steel gray, blue, and white threads, thus creating a myriad of shades per manufacturer, from actual light blue to almost a stone gray for some. With the north and east of France occupied by German troops, a large part of its wool production facilities would be lost. Thus, France would request that Great Britain, Spain, and the United States supply cloth that matched the light blue requirements, and nearly 10 million meters would be provided from these countries in total. The material provided was labeled English grey-blue cloth as a blanket term for all imported light blue cloth. The First Battle of the Marne in September 1914 had given the final killing blow to the Red Pants, with over 227,000 French casualties in the span of about a week. And I can't stress this enough, while the Red Pants were not the reason why there were so many losses, Adolphe Messime's disdain for the Red Pants had finally been vindicated in the eyes of the populace. It is worth keeping in mind that during the Battle of the Marne, the Germans were spotting French troops at the same ranges as the French were spotting German troops. So we can see here that in some cases, camouflage uniforms have no effect on spotting distance. Many people still believe that the Red Pants were the end-all be-all of early combat failures in the war. However, as you probably know, war and combat maneuvers are more nuanced than that, and the color of one's trousers is not a determinant factor in victory or defeat. So the light blue uniform was officially revealed to the public around November 1914, and by January 16, 1915, L'Illustration would refer to it as a, quote, a new gray-blue greatcoat called Horizon Color, end quote. This Horizon Blue name would be copied by other news outlets and would become the unofficial nickname of the new uniform. On January 26, 1915, the paper La Matin likened the new color to Horizon Blue. In February, the newspaper Le Temps compared the old and new uniform, saying, quote, the dark cloth of the old overcoats is seen side by side with the light azure of the new Horizon Color uniform, end quote. By the spring of 1915, this Horizon Blue nickname was widely used in the public. Soldier-to-soldier nicknames would also evolve with the uniform. Now, we all know of the nickname Poilu, which described the ruggedness, survivalist, and above all, bravery of the French soldier. However, as these new conscripts entered the army with these new light blue uniforms, the nickname Bluette would be used to describe these young soldiers. Bluette would later evolve to become the nickname given to fresh soldiers that recently arrived in frontline trenches, as their uniforms still had that clean light blue appearance and were not stained by the mud or elements. While the new color did not achieve the true neutral tone the original tricolor pattern had promised, due to the nature of early dyes, the cloth often faded to a light blue-gray, which melded well with the chalky mud of Champagne and Artois. The first actual deliveries of light blue uniforms reached the troops at the end of September 1914, and it would take about a year before the whole army is equipped with it. Priority was given to combat units when issuing the new uniform. By the end of May 1915, the cloth was reserved for the creation of greatcoats and kepis. In the meantime, overalls in wool and corduroy in black, brown, or dark blue would be worn over the red pants. The belt model 1845 and greatcoat buttons were to be tarnished with the soldier's black shoe polish to hide their shine. This period of uniform hodgepodge was called the clothing crisis. By the late spring of 1915, a sufficient amount of cloth was being produced in France and with a greater standardization of color. The imported cloth, which did not match the official color requirements, had been completely used up by this point. By the winter of 1915, a more uniformed uniform was evident in the ranks in regards to color and gear. However, it would not be until spring 1916 when true uniformity was achieved throughout the army, as cloth manufacturers finally had the material to create the light blue cloth to specification. Of course, this did not mean that the varying shades of Horizon Blue ceased to exist. Throughout the war, many different shades of Horizon Blue can be seen because the natural dyes used meant that the color would become more muted over time depending on exposure to the elements. By 1917 and 1918, the light blue uniform was entirely standardized in color, weave, and weight, not including private purchase options which may be made of a finer cloth. Late in the war, alizarin had begun to be created in France. However, there was already millions of light blue uniforms in use and available to the army, so by this point it was impossible to completely refit the light blue manufacturing process with the red thread to create tricolor cloth. So while synthetic red dye was now available in France, the light blue uniform remains unchanged. From the armistice in 1918, the question of the perfect uniform can become a topic of debate once again. Horizon blue was always thought of as not very ideal, as the color was unstable and naturally deteriorates in the sun and rain. It also failed to address the idea of a camouflaged uniform. The Ministry of War would therefore propose several proven camouflage colors for adoption in the Army. The competing shades were bluish Marengo Gray, British Khaki, Mustard Khaki, and once again, back from the dead, Reseda. On October 26, 1921, in the typical French fashion, the Commission rejected all that was proposed and decided to adopt American khaki instead. And on November 6, 1921, the Minister of War, Louis Berthoud, approved the opinion. Thus, Horizon Blue was declared obsolete. However, the large amount of existing light blue uniforms led to the Army holding on to the light blue for another 15 years before it disappeared completely within the French military. So that's the somewhat simplified story of Horizon Blue and how it came to be. Much like the developmental history of the Renault FT, one can really make an awesome historical drama out of the developmental history of the early 20th century French uniform. It's a heated political story with the monolith of tradition pushing back against the unflinching new way of war, where the nation that creates smokeless powder for their weaponry refuses to update their uniform for the new smokeless battlefield they themselves created. And a story that shows how the political answer to a problem may not always be the right answer. Now to talk a little bit about Horizon Blue for the aspiring Great War French Army reenactor. As you may have discovered already, as Great War French reenactors love mentioning it, perfect specification Horizon Blue reproduction cloth really doesn't exist. There are small vendors that still make small kit items in Horizon Blue to original specifications. However, to request a full uniform in accurate Horizon Blue usually means a wait time of like half a year. I'm much more on the side of not wanting to wait 6 months for any piece of gear, so I actually do recommend getting the base uniform from a brand like GSE. Not the top tier uniform option, however, once you give it a few upgrades, it becomes a decent option to get into the hobby. Hardcore bluettes might not like my take on this, but one of our jobs for the sake of sustaining the hobby is to get more people to play the game in a decent amount of time, not to have them wait over 6 months for gear only to become disinterested in the whole thing by like month 4. I will say though, to get as much accurate Horizon Blue as you can, not counting originals. Originals are rare nowadays and should stay on mannequins in museums, and examples in circulation around the world should be preserved and not worn. For top tier quality Horizon Blue gear, I will specifically mention Nice Collection here. At the time of filming, Kathy, the owner, produces the best accurate Horizon Blue cloth out there in my opinion. Lead times are quite manageable as well, about I'd say 4 weeks max, and they are quick to respond to emails. Seriously, one of the best vendors for Great War French gear out there. Now to show some examples of Great War Horizon Blue, I have all my examples of Horizon Blue displayed here. We have the canteen cover, the putties, as well as the insignias by Nice Collection. We have the breeches by a manufacturer that I don't even think exists anymore. Now in terms of the color, we can see that they are relatively all different shades of blue. As you can see, the putties are a little different than the GSC tunic, as well as the breeches and the canteen cover, as well as the labella rifle barrel cover. And in terms of weave, we can see that the tunic by GSE is the least accurate out of the bunch when you compare the tunic fabric itself versus the original specification Horizon Blue by Nice Collection on the insignias. And in terms of the weave quality of the canteen cover, the barrel cover, the putties, and the breeches, the quality here is actually quite good. And I got really lucky with the breeches as the company that manufactures them is basically gone now. The stock that remains in reenactment shops are basically the only ones that will ever be made ever again. And I managed to get one in my size, which happened to be the last one. So yeah, really lucky there. as this is the most accurate weave of Horizon Blue for a reproduction that is readily available, one that you don't have to order and wait 6 months for example. So if you see these versions floating around, I would try and get them, as the weave itself is very accurate to original Horizon Blue. And speaking of accurate, these two are from Nice Collection, and they are very, very good in terms of reproduction Horizon Blue. We're talking original specification. We can see the discoloration between the barrel cover and the canteen cover, as I had this barrel cover much longer than I had these two, and I did put it to good use in the dirt and all that stuff, so it has discolored over time. We can see here that reproduction Horizon Blue made to original specifications will discolor over time like originals, whereas a kind of generic Horizon Blue will discolor over time. You know, it is a uniform, you are going to put it to use, however, not as quickly as a naturally dyed original specification reproduction Horizon Blue fabric. And while I had the GSE tunic and the patches for the same length of time, of course, naturally dyed reproduction Horizon Blue will discolor at a faster rate than whatever the tunic is made out of. And some AS insignias over the background of matter red. We have the official insignia here of the Knight's helmet over 2 cross cannons, and then an unofficial Renault FT insignia. And you can see the differences in Horizon Blue here as well. Here is one by Nice Collection. It is less discolored than the one on my tunic, because I don't actually take this, patch out. It's more of a display example of 2 insignias. And then here is the Horizon Blue on the unofficial Renault FT patch. You can see here this one is a little gray than the regulation standard. So that gives you 2 examples of AS insignia as well as 2 examples of Horizon Blue color. So to sum up, we have the tunic, the patches, the breeches, the canteen cover, the barrel cover, and the puttees. And this shows the amount of variation in Horizon Blue in regards to the shade. It's just something to talk about at display events when people ask why you're so blue. I've always liked the French uniform of the Great War, before I knew anything about the war or even French gear. I always thought it was an odd choice of color, but ultimately looked interesting and unique. The uniform color would be one of the reasons I chose to LARP Great War French Army, apart from my interest in the Renault FT and French tank operations during the war. The French World War II uniforms are nice, but that uniqueness and, dare I say, soul in the kit is gone. I've just always been interested in that Great War theme of the Old World versus the New World clashing together. And this theme shows perfectly in the French uniform of the war, which had a modern cut and modern gear, but with an Old World color choice. Even with the 1914 uniforms, we can see the Old World clashing with the New World, with soldiers wearing black powder uniforms in the new smokeless powder battlefield. So this is the story of the origins of French Horizon Blue, a political drama centered around red pants, a new style of warfare, and the beginning of the end of the Old World. With the replacement of the matter red trousers, many at the time believed that a long-standing cherished romantic tradition had ended with it. However, the French soldier will prove that during the Great War, it was not the red pants that were France, but rather the soldiers themselves that embodied France. This has been a Tankiste from the 501st, wishing you good luck and good fortune on your impression.